Hello, this is, I lost the track, fifth or fourth video of chapter 13 lecture about is leisure fair. And we're talking about different examples, different cases, different social groups about leisure's fairness and unfairness potentially. And the second group that we want to discuss is women, because there's been a very focused research about women's leisure. And as we already learned in an earlier chapter, there's a major still, lingering gender gap in terms of leisure time, leisure activities, leisure experiences. In terms of women, the chapter makes this statement that almost every society has clear ideas about what behaviors, including leisure, are appropriate or inappropriate for women. And if you Google search, for example, girls' toy, you see a clear pattern. They're pinkish mauve, and they're related to domestic, work such as, kitchen, cooking, making up, and, aesthetic thing, and also taking care of baby, that type of thing. It's related to gender norm, very traditional gender norms, very clearly. And I want you to reflect on, for example, what sports team did your high school or maybe junior high not have for girls, women, compared to boys and men? It's often the case that, boys, men's side have more teams compared to women's side, girls' side. What are the sports that are missing on a girls' list, right? And those are the clear representation, manifestation of the ideas that we have, what behaviors women are supposed to or not supposed to do in our society. And we still have that issue. And in terms of women, the chapter cites one study from Ken Roberts. He's a British leisure scholar. And the chapter states this: in the developed countries, like Canada, the difference between men's and women's leisure have narrowed to an extent, maybe. For example, groups of women now enjoy girls' nights out in the same places, frequented by groups of men. And men and women spend generally the same number of hours watching television every day. Now, I want you to be really critic this, like really. For example, about their hanging out, going to the club, pub, bar, those things. Okay, maybe men and women or whatever other, gender identity you have, we all may go there. But what are their experiences and interactions at those bars and clubs and pubs? Now, oftentimes their interactions can be very, quote unquote, gender influenced by their gender identities. How they try to approach, if you're singles and available, try to, quote unquote, hook up culture sometimes. Who approaches who, which group approaches which, in what way, that's very gender nature. What about TV programs that we're watching? Maybe we're spending similar hours quantitatively, number-wise, but what about the things that we're watching? Are we watching the same amount of sports TV programs? Do you really think so? No. So we really, there's still, important distinction and differences between, across different gender groups that we should carefully examine. Well, that being said, of course, the situation has, I think, improved significantly compared to, for example, 60 years ago. And that should be also acknowledged, especially for women and gender minorities. For example, the textbook cites the information that the ratio, the percentage of the girls who play sports increased from 1 to 27. I think that's like 4%, a little less than 4%, to 2 to 5. And that's like 40%. That's 40%, right? 40. From the 1960s to today, maybe a few years ago, because the textbook is, written that time. Now, 1960, that's a significant historical time because it's what is called a pre-Title IX, and Title IX, it's in its states, constitutional, document that basically stated that impacted sports and physical education context in a school for women in the United States to provide an equal opportunity. And that was the foundation for example, many, high school, those grade school sports teams, as well as college sports opportunity for women as well. It was very important document, very important time. Now today, apparently, women make up about 45% of those professional sports fan base, like NFL football, MLB, Major League Baseball, NBA basketball, NASCAR in the United States, 45%. Is that a little surprising? I was surprised. That's a lot, actually. However, there are some gaps again, like I said in the last slide. For example, if you look at the Canadian statistics, percentage of women and men who meet the physical activity guideline, according to Canada. This is the stats from 2015 to 2018, right? The top is women, the below is men. Constantly, men tends to meet the guideline more, although we're not really, either group is not really necessarily doing a great job, actually. It's not like a 90%. But there's always a gap, about 8 to 9% constantly. And see, it's not getting better over these 4-year period. We don't have a newer data, but we'll see how that goes. There's that gender gap all the time. So we have conducted, again, a lot of research, especially female leisure scholars, and of course other scholars as well, have studied, dedicated their time and effort to understand leisure among women. And there's this person, Cara Henderson. She's a retired professor from, I think, North Carolina State, I think, down in the States. She has conducted reviews of studies. So these are not just one study, but they're paper that summarized studies over the past 10 years, 5 years. For example, a 1990 reviewed, I think this reviewed dozens of papers written in the 1980s, give or take. Those studies collectively discussed leisure constraints that are more common among women compared to men and other gender groups. One of those classic ones is this lack of sense of entitlement. What that means is that, so we're talking about 1980s and 70s when the research was conducted, original research was conducted, right? Still, the gender norms were very, very traditional. A lot of women stay at home, took up a lot of housework, child caring activities and all that, responsibilities and all that. So many of them didn't have a career per se and a stable income and a significant income per se. So they reported difficulty feeling, deserving to, for example, buying things for themselves, or, using resource time, having quote unquote me time, personal time to enjoy yourself, for example, or just doing something for fun for themselves. They had a struggle, this intrapersonal, they internalized this gender norm, and they felt difficulty feeling entitled to have leisure, to enjoy leisure. Another issue is something called a double shift. It's basically, when women had the career and job, right? The problem was they do the job, come back, and they have another, quote unquote, another shift or another work at home, taking care of the baby, kids, or, doing a lot of housework, so they didn't have a lot of leisure time, free time. And more importantly, that's important, limited free time, but their free time was also fragmented as in bits of time. Let's say they had 1 hour of free time per day, right? But it's one thing to have a 1 hour from, let's say, 8 to 9 p.m. Okay, that's 1 hour You can do certain things. You can work out, you can do yoga, you can watch some TVs, you can do certain things. But it's another thing to have a 5 minutes or 6 minutes chunk, 6 minutes chunk from right after you work out, right after you send out your kids to school, before your lunch break, and after you came back, before, after you, tack in your kids to the bed, if you have a 6 minutes bit, what can you do with those bits of free time, right? It's more limiting. So that's what we mean by fragmented time, and that's what women, especially from this period of time, first review time, reported. And of course, also gender norms around activity, what women are or are not supposed to do with more traditional time. And the next review, 1995, 1996 done. So it's the study reviewed were done in early 1990s, right? And those studies collectively talked about a lot of multiple different meanings of leisure. That even in this broad category of women, there are different differences, right? And differences of the experiences of leisure, the meanings, what they mean by leisure as well. And the third review is very important. They highlighted the concept called intersectionality. What that means is to really understand women's experience of leisure. We have to broaden our perspective. We shouldn't just look at the gender and womanhood per se, but also how that operates with the race. Because living as a woman is one thing in terms of how their leisure is shaped and reshaped in our society. But living as a woman of color is another thing they recognize. Or social class, they're coming from more poor economic status. That's another thing that we have to consider. Those major diversity factors, social demographic factors kind of, layer and impact our life and leisure differently. And that's what the intersectionality means. The next waves, next time, next group of studies of women's leisure collectively highlighted importance of resistance through gender non-conforming leisure activities. Do you remember, for example, in an earlier chapter, we talked about roller derby. Roller derby. It's like, you wear those, skate interline skating, inline skating, things. And what it does is that people make it, there are two teams together, and the offense and defense happen at the same time. And one person has to kind of pass out a team's member, make a circle. The other member try to block that point together, basically, with the body, basically. It's very physical. So that, for example, physicality, aggressiveness wasn't part of the traditional femininity, right? But doing those activities, maybe covering those activities, representing it through leisure, talking about those activities, watching those activities, really has challenged our idea about what it means to be a woman in our society, what femininity means, for example. It doesn't have to be timid, quote unquote, timid, passive. No, it can be assertive, it can be aggressive, it can be physical, right? So that's the resistance. And that's how leisure can potentially challenge some of the, confining and limiting gender roles and tradition. Now, one of the latest review showed that a lot of studies started to go beyond just woman-only analysis. And later on, we talk about the perspective called feminism and how that could apply not just to women food as well. So they would, if you really wanted to understand woman's, leisure in life, you have to think about the family. You have to look at the entire family. You have to think about their relationship, social relationship, which by definition include other gender groups, for example. And of course, they started to look at the different groups as well. Now the feminism. What feminism means is intellectual commitment as well as political movement that seeks equity for everyone, regardless of gender. However, of course, feminism in its roots has the motivation is this understanding and transforming, so changing patriarchal culture in society, so the male dominance in our society, which still exists in our society. I'm not sure about Canada, for example, pay gap, but I know in the United States, for example, it's 1 to 10 to 8. For the same job, for the same position, male gets, let's say, $100 per hour. Female would get $80. Audio chapter, we learned that there is still gender gap, about 30 minutes a day in Canada in terms of free time. And it's not improving. So there have been a group of scholars in leisure field who have used and devoted to this feminism perspective and try to understand the situation, leisure of the woman and other gender group, and try to address this patriarchal critic and change patriarchal system. And it's not, feminism is not just a thing that professors talk about and write about. It is also it's been popularized, it's in a pop culture. And in pop culture, as we learn in our audio chapter, is part of a big part of leisure, culture, and phenomena. For example, on the left side picture, who is this? She's my favorite. Beyonce, of course. And she's been, of course, eminent feminist artist and singer, right? And this is, I think, a picture from one of those halftime show of the Super Bowl, I think. It was the year when she did the thing with her, dancers who are also all women of color. And she's been also a strong feminist as well. She talked about, some of the songs and talk about some of the women food and gender issues as well. Right side of the picture is Emma Watson. She's the actress, right? And Harry Potter, and we know her as Hermione Granger. And so therefore it's pop culture. And she's been also a very strong advocate of the feminism and gender issues. I think she was ambassador, UN ambassador of the gender issue or something like that as well. So there's that too. It's not just the things that we do research around, but feminism happens in leisure, and we try to understand these phenomena as well and how these things impact people's ideas of gender and leisure as well. So this is the end of this video and woman section, and we're going to talk about the next group in the next chapter, next video.